There was a time when the fate of the world depended on a single technological advantage. Every new aircraft, every missile, every scientific breakthrough had the potential to change the balance of power between the United States and the Soviet Union. Unlike the devastating battles of World War II, the Cold War was fought in silence. There were no massive armies storming beaches or tanks rolling through enemy capitals. Instead, it became a conflict of intelligence, innovation, and engineering. The world's two greatest superpowers entered a race unlike anything history had ever witnessed, each determined to prove that its technology, its scientists, and its military could outperform the other. During those dangerous decades, a single invention could change military strategy overnight. One aircraft could reveal secrets worth more than an entire army. One scientific breakthrough could decide who would dominate the skies, the oceans, and eventually even space. It was a war where knowledge became the deadliest weapon ever created. The Soviet Union understood that better than anyone. After emerging from the Second World War as one of the world's most powerful nations, Moscow invested unimaginable amounts of money into building a military machine capable of matching and eventually surpassing the United States. New fighter aircraft entered service every few years. Missile technology advanced at breathtaking speed. Nuclear weapons multiplied on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Across the vast Soviet landscape, enormous radar stations appeared one after another, connected to a defensive network designed to detect any threat approaching from thousands of miles away. Hundreds of interceptor pilots trained every day for the moment they believed would eventually come. To Soviet military planners, the next war would begin, not with soldiers crossing borders, but with aircraft appearing on radar screens. And when that day arrived, they believed they would be ready. The United States reached a very different conclusion. American intelligence agencies faced a problem unlike any they had encountered before. The Soviet Union was becoming increasingly secretive. Nuclear missile sites were hidden deep inside remote forests. Air bases disappeared beneath layers of camouflage. Experimental aircraft were tested hundreds of miles away from foreign observers. Every year, gathering reliable intelligence became more difficult. Washington knew that without accurate information, every military decision became little more than an educated guess. How many missiles did the Soviets possess? How quickly could they launch a nuclear strike? What new weapons were being developed behind the walls of isolated research facilities? Nobody could answer those questions with certainty, and uncertainty was perhaps the most dangerous enemy of all. For years, America relied on reconnaissance aircraft that flew dangerously close to Soviet territory, collecting photographs and electronic signals whenever possible. Some missions succeeded, others ended in disaster. Every flight carried enormous political risks. If an aircraft was shot down, an international crisis could erupt overnight. As Soviet air defenses improved, flying over hostile territory became increasingly dangerous. American military planners realized something extraordinary had to be built. They didn't simply need a faster airplane. They needed an aircraft capable of doing something the world had never seen before. An aircraft that could survive not by fighting enemy defenses, but by making those defenses almost irrelevant. That impossible challenge landed on the desks of a small group of engineers working inside one of the most secretive organizations in American history. Hidden behind locked doors and protected by extraordinary levels of security, Lockheed's legendary Skunk Works had already earned a reputation for solving problems everyone else considered impossible. Led by the brilliant engineer Clarence Kelly Johnson, The team had developed revolutionary aircraft throughout the previous 2 decades. Johnson believed that bureaucracy slowed innovation, so he built his projects differently. Small teams, total secrecy, faster decisions, radical ideas. If anyone in America could create an aircraft capable of outrunning an entire nation's air defense network, it would be Kelly Johnson and the engineers of Skunk Works. But building such a machine seemed almost impossible. Conventional aircraft were limited by the very laws of physics. At extreme speeds, air friction generated enormous amounts of heat, enough to weaken aluminum structures and destroy engines. Flying higher created different problems. The air became thinner, reducing engine performance and making control surfaces less effective. Fuel systems behaved unpredictably. Metal expanded under intense temperatures. Even cockpit windows risked cracking from thermal stress. Every solution created two new problems. To many engineers, the aircraft America wanted simply could not exist. Yet the pressure kept growing. Every month that passed without reliable intelligence increased the risk of strategic surprise. Washington couldn't afford to fall behind. The Cold War wasn't slowing down. It was accelerating. Nuclear arsenals continued expanding. Both sides tested more powerful missiles. Military exercises became larger and more aggressive. Around the world, proxy conflicts erupted as the United States and the Soviet Union competed for influence without confronting each other directly. Beneath the surface, both governments were preparing for the possibility that one misunderstanding, one radar mistake, or one political decision could trigger a conflict unlike anything humanity had ever experienced. Then, something remarkable happened. Instead of asking what existing technology could accomplish, Kelly Johnson's team began asking a different question. What if they ignored every traditional limitation of aircraft design? What if speed itself became the aircraft's primary defense? What if no missile could reach it? What if no fighter could climb high enough to engage it? What if survival depended not on armor or weapons, but on staying permanently beyond the enemy's ability to react? Those questions would eventually lead to one of the most extraordinary engineering projects ever undertaken by the United States. But before the aircraft, the world would later know, as the SR-71 Blackbird could dominate the skies, America first had to overcome engineering challenges that many experts believed were completely impossible. Long before Soviet radar operators watched an unidentified aircraft disappear from their screens, long before interceptor pilots desperately pushed their aircraft beyond their limits, a handful of engineers inside a quiet building in California had already begun changing the future of aviation forever. What they were about to create wouldn't simply become another reconnaissance aircraft. It would become a machine so far ahead of its time that even decades later, military historians would still describe it as one of the greatest technological achievements of the 20th century. And once it finally took to the skies, the Soviet Union would discover that its greatest challenge during the Cold War wasn't an army, a fleet, or a nuclear weapon. It was an airplane that seemed to ignore the limits of human engineering. Long before the Soviet Union realized an American aircraft was slipping through its vast air defense network, the race had already begun behind closed doors in Washington. Every intelligence report arriving from Eastern Europe painted the same disturbing picture. The Soviet military was expanding at an unprecedented pace. New missile complexes appeared in remote regions. Long-range bombers were entering service. Massive underground facilities were being constructed beyond the reach of satellites, which at the time were still in their infancy. Every month, brought new uncertainties, and in a conflict where a single mistake could trigger nuclear war, uncertainty was the one thing the United States could not afford. American intelligence agencies desperately needed answers. How many intercontinental ballistic missiles did the Soviet Union actually possess? Were reports of new nuclear weapons accurate, or were they part of an elaborate deception campaign? How quickly could Soviet forces mobilize if war suddenly erupted? These weren't simply questions for military analysts. They were questions that could determine the survival of millions of people. Without reliable intelligence, every decision made by the White House carried enormous risks. The United States wasn't looking for another fighter aircraft. It was looking for something that could see behind the Iron Curtain without being stopped. Only a few years earlier, American reconnaissance had suffered one of its greatest setbacks. In May 1960, a high-altitude U-2 spy plane, piloted by Francis Gary Powers, was shot down deep inside Soviet territory. For years, the aircraft had flown above altitudes believed to be unreachable by enemy defenses. But Soviet missile technology had advanced faster than American planners expected. Powers survived the crash and was captured alive, creating one of the biggest diplomatic crises of the Cold War. Overnight, the mission exposed an uncomfortable reality. Flying high was no longer enough. If America wanted to continue gathering intelligence inside the Soviet Union, it would need something dramatically faster, dramatically higher, and dramatically more advanced than anything ever built before. Inside Lockheed's Skunk Works, Kelly Johnson already understood the challenge better than anyone. His engineers weren't being asked to improve an existing aircraft. They were being asked to redefine aviation itself. Every design meeting revolved around one impossible objective: build an aircraft that enemy missiles would never reach and enemy fighters would never catch. It sounded less like an engineering project and more like science fiction. Yet Johnson believed impossible problems could be solved if engineers stopped thinking like everyone else. The first concepts pushed every known technological boundary. Engineers proposed an aircraft capable of cruising at speeds exceeding 3 times the speed of sound. Not for a few seconds during a test flight, but for hours at a time. At those incredible velocities, the aircraft's skin would become so hot that ordinary aluminum would literally begin to lose its structural strength. Temperatures along the leading edges would rise to hundreds of degrees Celsius, hot enough to cause severe burns within seconds of contact. Traditional aviation materials simply could not survive those conditions. That realization forced the engineers to make one of the boldest decisions in aviation history. Instead of aluminum, they chose titanium, a metal rarely used in aircraft manufacturing at the time. Titanium offered exceptional strength, while resisting the extreme temperatures generated during sustained high-speed flight. But there was a problem. Producing large quantities of titanium was incredibly expensive, extremely difficult to machine, and, in one of history's great ironies, much of the world's supply originated from companies linked to the Soviet Union itself. Through a complex network of shell companies and international suppliers, the United States quietly acquired enormous amounts of Soviet titanium, material that would eventually become the very aircraft designed to spy on the Soviet Union. Every solution created another obstacle. Titanium expanded significantly as temperatures increased. Engineers discovered that if they built the aircraft with perfectly sealed fuel tanks on the ground, the expansion during flight could cause structural damage. Their solution seemed unbelievable. The aircraft would intentionally leak fuel while sitting on the runway. Only after reaching cruising speed, when the metal expanded under intense heat, would the fuel tanks seal properly? Pilots became accustomed to watching fuel drip beneath the aircraft before every mission, knowing that what looked like a serious mechanical problem was actually an intentional feature of one of the most advanced airplanes ever conceived. The engines presented an even greater challenge. Conventional jet engines simply couldn't operate efficiently across such an enormous speed range. At lower speeds, the aircraft needed enough thrust to take off like a normal airplane. At Mach 3, however, the airflow entering the engines behaved almost like an explosion trapped inside a metal tube. Managing that airflow required engineering solutions, unlike anything attempted before. The result was the revolutionary Pratt and Whitney J58 engine, capable of transforming its own operation as speed increased. At cruising velocity, much of the thrust came not from traditional jet combustion, but from carefully managing the tremendous energy of the incoming supersonic airflow itself. In many ways, the engine became part jet engine, part ramjet, allowing the aircraft to sustain speeds that seemed impossible only a decade earlier. As the project advanced through the early 1960s, secrecy became almost as important as engineering. Thousands of workers participated without fully understanding what they were building. Components arrived under false project names. Test flights were conducted in isolated desert locations far from public view. Even within the United States government, only a small circle of officials knew the true capabilities of the mysterious black aircraft slowly taking shape inside Lockheed's facilities. Rumors spread among military personnel. Some believed America was building an experimental bomber. Others whispered about a new interceptor capable of outrunning missiles. The truth remained hidden behind layers of classified documents and security clearances. Then, after years of relentless engineering, thousands of design revisions, and countless hours of testing, the impossible finally left the ground. For the first time, American engineers watched an aircraft accelerate beyond Mach 3 while climbing into the edge of the stratosphere. Every successful test proved something extraordinary. The impossible wasn't impossible anymore. They had created an aircraft unlike anything the world had ever seen. But the greatest test still lay ahead. Because somewhere beyond the Atlantic Ocean, inside heavily fortified Soviet command centers, thousands of radar operators, interceptor pilots, and military commanders had absolutely no idea that the most difficult target they would ever face was preparing for its first operational missions. When the Blackbird officially entered service during the mid-1960s, the balance of the Cold War quietly began to change. There was no public announcement describing its true capabilities. No military parade introduced it to the world. Most Americans had never even heard its name. Behind layers of classified documents, the aircraft began carrying out one of the most dangerous missions imaginable. Its objective was simple in theory, but incredibly risky in practice. Fly close enough to the Soviet Union and its allies to collect intelligence that satellites still couldn't provide, then return home before anyone could stop it. Every mission followed a carefully planned routine. Pilots spent hours preparing their bodies for the extreme conditions they would face. They wore specialized pressure suits similar to those used by astronauts, knowing that at the Blackbird's operating altitude, a loss of cabin pressure could become fatal within seconds. Before takeoff, they breathed pure oxygen to remove nitrogen from their bloodstream, reducing the risk of decompression sickness. Every detail mattered because the aircraft wasn't simply flying higher than commercial airliners. It was operating on the edge of space, in an environment few humans had ever experienced. As the Blackbird accelerated down the runway, There was nothing particularly dramatic about its appearance. It looked sleek, unusual, and undeniably futuristic, but nothing suggested that within minutes it would become one of the fastest aircraft ever built. Only after reaching altitude did its true personality emerge. The engines roared with increasing efficiency as the aircraft continued accelerating beyond the speed of sound. Mach 1 became Mach 2, then Mach 3. Temperatures across the titanium skin climbed so high that the aircraft literally expanded in flight, exactly as its engineers had predicted years earlier. Everything about the Blackbird had been designed for this moment. Then came the part that worried American intelligence the most. As the aircraft approached Soviet-controlled regions, thousands of radar stations stretching across Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union began scanning the skies exactly as they had every hour of every day for years. Their operators had become accustomed to identifying commercial airliners, military patrol aircraft, weather phenomena, and the occasional reconnaissance flight. Nothing in their training had prepared them for what they were about to see. A radar return suddenly appeared. At first, it seemed insignificant, just another contact moving toward the edge of Soviet airspace, but within seconds, confusion spread through the radar room. The target was moving far faster than expected. Operators checked their equipment. Some adjusted calibration settings, convinced the system had produced a false reading. Others requested confirmation from neighboring radar stations. The answer came back almost immediately. They were all seeing the same thing. Within minutes, the information climbed the chain of command. Telephone lines lit up as reports reached regional headquarters. Senior officers were called into operations rooms. Large tracking maps began updating with every new radar sweep. The unidentified aircraft continued moving with extraordinary speed, maintaining an altitude few believed possible for any operational airplane. Interceptor squadrons received emergency orders. Pilots who had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of mission rushed toward their aircraft. Ground crews removed safety equipment as engines roared to life across military airfields. Some of the Soviet Union's fastest fighters climbed into the sky, their crews confident that whatever had entered their detection range would soon be identified or destroyed. But almost immediately, they encountered a problem no training exercise had ever simulated. The target wasn't slowing down. In fact, every second that passed increased the distance between the interceptors and the mysterious aircraft. Soviet pilots climbed aggressively, pushing their aircraft toward their operational ceilings, while ground controllers continuously updated the target's position. Yet every new radar sweep produced the same frustrating result. The unknown aircraft remained out of reach. As interceptor pilots struggled to gain altitude, commanders authorized surface-to-air missile units to prepare for possible engagement. These missile systems represented the pride of Soviet air defense. Only a few years earlier, similar weapons had successfully destroyed Francis Gary Powers' U-2 reconnaissance aircraft, proving that even high-altitude American spy planes were vulnerable. Surely this aircraft would meet the same fate. Yet reality unfolded very differently. Calculations performed inside missile command centers revealed a disturbing problem. By the time firing solutions could be completed, the target had already traveled miles beyond the predicted interception point. Every attempt to calculate its future position became increasingly difficult because the aircraft's extraordinary speed left almost no margin for reaction. It wasn't simply flying fast, it was compressing time itself. For Soviet commanders, This created an entirely new type of military problem. Their defenses had been designed around the assumption that enemy aircraft could be tracked, engaged, and intercepted within predictable time frames. The Blackbird ignored those assumptions completely. Before decisions could move through the military chain of command, the aircraft was already approaching the limits of radar coverage. Inside Soviet headquarters, disbelief slowly turned into concern. Military analysts gathered every available radar recording. Engineers examined tracking data frame by frame. Intelligence officers searched desperately for clues about this unknown American aircraft. Some questioned whether the United States had developed an entirely new propulsion system. Others feared Western engineers had achieved technological breakthroughs the Soviet Union hadn't anticipated. One conclusion became increasingly difficult to avoid. America had built something years ahead of anything Soviet planners believed possible. The Blackbird wasn't merely collecting intelligence. With every successful mission, it was exposing weaknesses inside one of the largest and most expensive air defense networks ever constructed. Every flight demonstrated that billions of rubles invested in radar stations, interceptor aircraft, and missile batteries still weren't enough to guarantee complete control of Soviet skies. For the Kremlin, the implications were deeply unsettling. If one unarmed reconnaissance aircraft could repeatedly evade interception, what other American technologies remained hidden from Soviet intelligence? It was a question that would shape military planning for years to come, and it marked only the beginning of the Soviet Union's struggle against one of the most extraordinary aircraft ever built. For Soviet military leaders, accepting defeat was never an option. Every successful Blackbird mission represented another victory for American intelligence and another humiliation for the Soviet air defense system. Allowing an enemy aircraft to operate so close to sensitive military installations without consequence was simply unacceptable. Behind closed doors, orders were issued to study the mysterious aircraft in every possible way. Radar recordings were analyzed repeatedly. Intelligence officers collected reports from every interceptor pilot who had attempted to pursue it. Engineers searched for weaknesses. Somewhere they believed the Americans had made a mistake. They just had to find it. The first strategy was simple. If existing interceptor aircraft couldn't catch the intruder, then faster aircraft would have to be built. Throughout the late 1960s, Soviet engineers accelerated work on new, high-speed interceptors capable of climbing higher and flying faster than previous generations. Among them was the MiG-25 Foxbat, an aircraft that would eventually become one of the fastest fighters ever placed into operational service. Western intelligence watched the Foxbat's development with growing concern, believing it might outperform nearly every fighter in the American inventory. On paper, it appeared to be exactly the aircraft the Soviet Union needed. But the reality proved far more complicated. The MiG-25 was incredibly fast, yet even its impressive performance came with limitations. Flying at extreme speed for extended periods placed enormous stress on its engines, reducing their lifespan dramatically. Pilots could briefly approach the Blackbird's speed under ideal circumstances, but they could not sustain it. More importantly, interception wasn't simply about matching maximum speed. The interceptor had to know exactly where the target would be minutes in advance, climb to the correct altitude, accelerate into position, and arrive at precisely the right moment. Against ordinary aircraft, this process worked well. Against the SR-71, it became a race against time that Soviet pilots almost always lost before it even began. Again and again, alarms echoed across Soviet air bases. Pilots sprinted toward their waiting aircraft, while radar controllers calculated interception routes with extraordinary precision. The MiG-25 would roar into the sky, climbing as rapidly as possible toward the edge of its performance envelope. Inside the cockpit, pilots watched guidance instructions transmitted from ground control, each update bringing them closer to what should have been visual contact. But the moment never came. Before the Foxbat reached the required altitude and position, the Blackbird had already traveled dozens of miles farther along its route. Sometimes Soviet pilots reported seeing nothing at all. Other times, they caught only a brief glimpse of a distant black shape disappearing into the horizon faster than they could react. For many of those pilots, it became one of the most frustrating experiences of their careers. They possessed one of the fastest interceptor aircraft in the world, yet they remained spectators in a chase they could never truly join. Missile systems offered little comfort. The Soviet Union deployed increasingly sophisticated surface-to-air missiles designed specifically to defend strategic locations against high-altitude threats. Their tracking radars improved. Guidance systems became more accurate. Engagement ranges increased with every new generation. On paper, Soviet air defenses continued growing stronger year after year. Yet the Blackbird continued flying its missions. One of the reasons was surprisingly simple. The SR-71 rarely depended on maneuvering to survive. Unlike fighter aircraft engaged in dogfights, the Blackbird's greatest defense was its extraordinary ability to remain ahead of the enemy's decision-making process. Detecting the aircraft wasn't enough. Every layer of Soviet defense required time. Radar operators needed to confirm the contact. Information had to be transmitted through command centers. Orders had to reach interceptor squadrons and missile batteries. Pilots needed to start engines, take off, climb, and position themselves for interception. Missile crews needed firing solutions based on predicted flight paths. The SR-71 was so fast that it continuously stole those precious minutes. Military analysts later compared the problem to trying to hit a rifle bullet with another rifle bullet after seeing only its vapor trail. Every second of delay dramatically reduced the chance of success. By the time Soviet commanders completed one stage of the interception process, the Blackbird had already advanced to the next phase of its mission. American crews understood this advantage perfectly. Pilots often joked that if they received a missile warning while cruising at operational speed, the safest response wasn't to turn sharply or dive toward the ground. It was simply to push the throttles forward. At first glance, the statement sounded almost unbelievable, yet there was solid engineering behind it. The faster the Blackbird flew, the more difficult interception calculations became. Every increase in speed reduced the enemy's reaction time even further, forcing Soviet systems to solve an almost impossible mathematical problem in real time. The aircraft wasn't escaping because Soviet operators lacked skill or courage. Many of them were among the finest professionals in the world. The challenge was that they were confronting a machine specifically designed to exploit the smallest delays within an enormous defensive network. Inside the Kremlin, concern gradually evolved into determination. If the Blackbird couldn't be destroyed, perhaps it could be discouraged. Soviet commanders increased patrol activity along likely flight paths. Additional radar stations were activated. New interceptor tactics were tested. Electronic intelligence units carefully monitored every appearance of the mysterious American aircraft, hoping repeated observations would eventually reveal predictable patterns. Instead, the opposite happened. Every mission expanded American understanding of Soviet defenses. Every radar activation exposed another surveillance site. Every interceptor scramble revealed response times. Every missile tracking attempt generated valuable electronic intelligence. Ironically, the harder the Soviet Union worked to stop the Blackbird, the more information the Blackbird collected. It was an intelligence officer's dream. Mission after mission, thousands of photographs returned to analysts in the United States. They revealed airfields, submarine bases, missile deployments, industrial complexes, and military construction projects with remarkable clarity. During a period when satellites were still limited by orbital paths and weather conditions, the SR-71 provided something even more valuable. Timely, flexible intelligence gathered exactly where decision-makers needed it most. Years passed. The Blackbird continued flying. The Soviet Union continued trying. Neither side underestimated the other. American planners respected Soviet technological capabilities, while Soviet commanders never dismissed the Blackbird as a simple reconnaissance aircraft. They recognized it for what it truly was, one of the most sophisticated intelligence platforms ever created. By the time its operational career began approaching its final years, one fact had become impossible for military historians to ignore. Despite decades of Cold War tension, despite countless tracking attempts, despite thousands of interceptor sorties and the most extensive air defense network on Earth, no enemy had ever successfully shot down an SR-71 Blackbird. That remarkable record transformed the aircraft into something far greater than an engineering achievement. It became a symbol of a unique moment in history, a moment when American innovation forced an entire superpower to rethink the limits of technology, strategy, and the future of aerial reconnaissance itself.